Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
My parents put a house in my brother's name, and a handful of days later, they tried to fold me into his crisis by asking me to co-sign his loans, and I remember how my mouth felt dry and my heartbeat felt strangely steady as I said, without a raised voice or a speech, that they had already picked their favorite and that he could handle it, and the kind of silence that followed was not relief or shock so much as an exposed truth finally sitting in the middle of the table where nobody could pretend not to see it anymore. I did not come to that sentence by accident, because for years I told myself that I was overreacting, that the little slights were just misunderstandings, that maybe I was too sensitive or too independent or too proud. Yet the record kept writing itself in ways that were impossible to miss, like when my brother's car problems were solved by a quiet transfer at a family bank while I was cobbling together bus schedules and ride shares between shifts, or when his tuition was smoothed out by a temporary loan that never needed repayment while I took extra credits and extra work and learned what it means to calculate interest in real time and keep moving anyway. Every time I raised an eyebrow, there was a script, and they performed it with the ease of people who have rehearsed it for years, telling me that he just needed a push because he was under pressure and he carried family pride and it was different for boys, and telling me that I was resilient and smart and would be fine, and I hate how those words burrowed inside me and turned into this idea that not needing help meant not deserving it, as if competence were a reason to be deprived and helplessness were a qualification for gifts. I tried to be fair with myself and with them, I really did, because it is easy to count other people's blessings and forget your own, and I did not want to become the person who keeps score in a way that poisons every memory. But some things do not feel like generosity as much as they feel like policy, and the house in his name was not an impulsive present or a sentimental gesture. It was a document with signatures and a deed and comments under his photo that said things like, "So proud of you. You deserve it." And I wish I could say I heard about it from them in a thoughtful conversation, but I found out the way everyone else did, through a glossy post that asked the world to clap. I stared at that post longer than I should have, not because I wanted the house, but because it was the way the story was told, as if my parents had arrived at a fair conclusion after weighing all possibilities. As if my name had never existed on any list and never needed to, and I made myself swallow the ugly feeling and send a polite text that said congratulations, knowing full well that I was congratulating a system that had worked exactly as designed. When I finally saw them in person, they were bright with that careful cheerfulness people use when they are carrying something heavy behind their back, and my mother asked about my job in a way that sounded like a checklist tick rather than curiosity. And my father did the same polite nodding thing he does when he wants to steer a conversation without owning the steering, and my brother sat with the lazy grin of someone who has never had to wonder if the safety net will hold, because the net in his life is not a net at all, it is a floor. They did not bring up the house, not directly, because that would have required acknowledging that there was anything to discuss. And instead they slid into small talk and asked about a trip I had postponed and a project I was finishing and whether I had finally upgraded my car, and it all felt like they were circling a runway where the plane was going to land whether I cleared it or not. And I smiled in the way daughters smile when they are waiting for the real reason they were invited. I kept thinking about what it meant to be asked for trust by people who had not trusted me with honesty, and how strange it is to be valued for your credit score rather than your character. To be told that you are reliable in a way that magically transforms into obligation, to be praised for standing on your own feet until the moment your balance can be used to prop up someone else's comfort. And I could feel the shape of their argument before I heard it, the familiar blend of duty and love that always seems to mean sacrifice for me and rescue for him. My brother, who has perfected the role of charming chaos, began warming me up over text in the days that followed, not by apologizing or acknowledging the house, but by throwing out casual lines about stress and expectations and how success is a team sport and family is supposed to pull together, and there was a part of me that almost stepped toward him because I have trained myself to be reasonable. But then I remembered the nights I picked up extra hours while he picked up extra hobbies, and somehow both were treated as equally serious. I am not pretending I did not benefit from anything, because every family has its shared resources and its shared messes, but I learned early to fix my own leaks and pay my own penalties and plan my own insurance. And it is wild how people will misname that as selfishness when it stops being convenient for them, as if the only acceptable kind of independence is the kind that can be cashed in on demand. The day the ask finally came, it arrived wrapped in hospitality, a dinner invitation with a little heart my mother still uses as if hearts were punctuation marks that made requests softer. And I said yes because I wanted to be in the room where the performance had to be delivered without edits, where they would have to look at me and say the words and call it nothing more than a signature and a short-term favor that would not touch me, and where I could decide whether I would continue to be the person who takes a blow and smooths it into silence or the person who lets the silence belong to everyone else for once. I did not plan a speech, and I did not rehearse a monologue, because the truth does not require decoration when it has finally been seen, and as I walked to my car I knew that whatever happened at that table, whatever script they tried to hand me, I had already chosen the ending, and I was going to make them say their lines all the way to the last period before I said mine. So I went to that dinner with my face calm and my stomach tight and my spine steady, ready to watch them unwrap their favor and call it family. And I decided that when the moment arrived I would not flinch, I would not negotiate, and I would not explain. Because explanations are how I have been emptied for years, and this time they were going to hear the sound of a door remain closed, even as I smiled and passed the salt, and even as the word cosign hovered like a fly they kept pretending not to notice. They set the table with that practice cheer that always shows up when something uncomfortable is about to be served alongside whatever is on the plates, and my mother started with questions that skimmed the surface of my life as if depth might trigger turbulence. And my father nodded on cue and laughed a little too quickly, while my brother leaned back like a man auditioning for the role of harmless charm, and I let it all float by because I knew the real reason I had been invited and I wanted them to land it without my help, since it mattered to me that they hear themselves ask for the thing they had already decided I owed them. It arrived the way these things always do in families that confuse duty with devotion, with my mother sighing that my brother had taken on more than he expected because the payments were heavier than the bank originally estimated and the adjustable rate had not been kind, with my father adding that my credit was sterling and I was organized and steady and practically made for paperwork, with my brother jumping in to say it was just a signature and a formality and that nothing would touch me, because he had everything under control, and I listened without interrupting because I wanted the entire script on the record in one clean take. I asked simple questions that were not really simple, like what the exact payment history looked like and how many months had been paid on time and whether there were late fees hiding behind polite wording. And I asked what the loan-to-value number actually was now that the house had been in his name for all of a handful of days, and whether there were other debts that might suddenly graduate into emergencies once my name was attached to the first one. And every answer arrived wrapped in fog, which told me everything I needed to know about the honesty of the request and the quality of the risk. They did what they always do when details start to make the room feel smaller, pivoting to character, saying I had always been good with money and that I had a generous heart and that family pulls together, which would have sounded noble if it had not been delivered by the same people who told me to be proud of doing it alone while quietly underwriting my brother's life, as if that were some kind of natural law. And I felt my mouth tilt into a smile that was not anger so much as clarity, because I finally saw how tidy the machine was when it ran unchallenged. I told them I was happy to consider a family agreement if we were all speaking the same language, and by that I meant a written summary sent to my email that spelled out the loan amount in words, the missed payments in words, the interest terms in words, and the plan to repay in words, and I said it just like that because I wanted to watch the flinch at the word written, since writing turns casual manipulation into something visible and permanent, and my mother's eyes flickered in that quick way that admits more than a yes or a no ever could. My brother chuckled like I had told a cute joke and said it was not that deep and that he would make the payments because he had a raise coming and a bonus later this year and that I would never even notice the cosign on my record. And I let him finish his little commercial before I said that my policy, which, yes, I have, is that I never place my name on debt unless there is equal collateral in my name, which in this case could be the house they placed in his, and that I would consider signing the loan if the deed were adjusted to reflect shared ownership proportionate to the risk I was being asked to absorb. The way the air moved after that sentence told me I had finally stepped off their script, because my father's chair made that small backward squeak of retreat and my mother started rearranging napkins that were already straight. And my brother's mouth did that thing where a smile curdles into confusion and then into offense, and he asked if I was actually trying to steal his house, and I said I was not trying to steal anything, I was setting a boundary that had been missing since childhood. And that what I proposed was the same fairness they claimed to cherish whenever it tilted in his direction. I said that if they were confident in his responsibility, then placing me on the title as collateral should be an easy lift, and if they were not confident enough to share the asset, then they were not really asking me to safekeep his future. They were asking me to ensure their favoritism with my credit, and my mother whispered that I was being dramatic and cruel, and I said I was being precise, which is the opposite of cruel, and I watched my father look at the floor like he always does when integrity starts to cost more than comfort. My brother started raising his voice about trust and loyalty and about how families do not litigate love, and I said families also do not ask a daughter to guarantee the debts of a son who was just handed a house, and that I would be the first to celebrate his independence when it looked like independence rather than a group project with my name on the line, and there was a pause that felt like the moment a courtroom waits for a verdict. Except this time I was both jury and judge and also the only person who had read the case file. I stood up not to make a scene but to take back my time, and I told them that if they wanted me to consider anything beyond a firm no, they could email me the full request with the numbers written out, and they could call the title office in the morning and ask what it takes to add a co-owner as collateral for a cosign. And then they could decide whether they wanted fairness or whether they only wanted my reliability, and that either way I would not be the quiet solution they kept in a drawer for emergencies. On my way out, I sent a short message to myself that felt like a private ceremony, a reminder to place a freeze with all 3 bureaus before I slept and to add a passphrase to my files, not because I was afraid they would act in bad faith, though the thought had crossed my mind, but because setting locks is what you do when you have spent years being the open door in a house where everyone else lives rent-free, and I realized that this, too, was a form of revenge that did not require noise to be effective. I left them with a polite hug that was not an invitation and a simple line that sounded almost kind, telling them to send the email after they spoke to the title office and that I would read it carefully. And as I closed the door, I could hear the quiet scramble of people rehearsing a new script they never planned to learn, and I knew the messages would start arriving before the night was over, and I also knew my answer would be waiting for them in the morning, written out as clearly as anything I had ever said in my life. After that dinner where I handed them a clean and reasonable path that required nothing more explosive than writing down the truth and matching risk with collateral, the messages started arriving in the careful order that always reveals how a family tries to steer a person back into the role they prefer. With my mother opening the dance by sending long notes about how life is unpredictable and how sometimes the strong one has to be the bridge just a little longer, with my father following up by pretending neutrality while pointing out that banks love clear files and that a signature from me would cost nothing but would buy peace for everyone, and with my brother dropping in last, acting unserious in a way that was supposed to lighten the load while also making it clear that he expected results, because in his world expectations are not plans, they are guarantees paid for by other people and decorated with jokes. I kept answering in the same measured way I had used at the table, repeating that I would consider anything that arrived in writing with the numbers spelled out and a concrete plan attached and the title adjusted to reflect shared responsibility. And each time I wrote that sentence, I could feel the heat rise on the other side of the phone, because writing removes wiggle room and because putting my name on the asset would turn their favorite into a shared project rather than a protected throne. And what they wanted was not fairness or clarity. What they wanted was my reliability pressed like a stamp onto their decisions, so that the document would be complete without them facing what completion actually meant. There was a day in my early 20s when my car coughed its way to a stop and I called home from the curb holding a repair estimate that looked like a riddle printed in a larger font than my paycheck. And my parents told me gently that independence is a muscle that grows when you use it, and I believed them and found a way through by taking shifts that ran late into a morning and selling a few things I should have kept. And I remembered that story while reading my mother's message about how family pulls together, because I did pull together back then and nobody reached for the other end of the rope, which is fine when it is a philosophy and not fine when it is suddenly abandoned, because their son is the one with the knot around his ankles. So I moved from philosophy to process, placing freezes with all 3 bureaus in a single sitting and adding a passphrase to my bank files and turning on 2-factor authentication for every account that mattered. Not because I thought my parents would sprint across a legal line, although history suggests that lines get blurry when panic is stirring the pot, but because I have learned that love without boundaries becomes demand, and I was done mistaking my endurance for consent. And since their approach had always been to treat me like a policy rather than a person, I decided to treat my protection like a policy too, complete with documentation and receipts. When my father called to say he had spoken to a loan officer who agreed that my cosign would make the entire problem disappear and that he had penciled in a time later in the week for me to swing by and add my signature, I said in the calmest voice I own that no one had my permission to discuss my credit or place my name anywhere, that any appointment, including my presence, would only exist if it was scheduled by me, and that I would be calling the same bank after we hung up to enter a written note that no authorization exists, and he said I was overreacting because pencil is not ink. And I said that lines begin as pencil marks and that people who are certain of their ethics do not start drawing anything at all without the consent of the person whose name sits on the line. My brother tried a different door, texting a long list of times he says I stayed at his place for free, leaving out the part where I was there to dog sit during his vacations or to clean up after the party he forgot to host responsibly. And he added a memory about how he loaned me a few dollars for gas during a holiday when I had already paid for most of the groceries and all of the driving, and I realized that a person who tallies favors without counting context is a person who views relationships like a ledger with only one column, and I refuse to become a number in a book he only opens when he is short. I did call the bank and I did place the note and I did ask for a confirmation email because confirmation is the only language institutions respect, and then I wrote one precise message to my parents and to my brother in a single thread, summarizing my terms in full sentences written like agreements and not like apologies, and I gave them a reasonable deadline, and I added that any attempt to move forward without my explicit written consent would trigger a police report and a formal complaint. Not because I wanted that smoke, but because warnings prevent fires when the people playing with matches finally believe the smoke alarm has batteries that work. That night, while I was washing dishes and thinking about how quiet the house felt when nobody was demanding anything from me, my phone lit up with an alert from one of the bureaus saying there had been a hard inquiry attempt that could not proceed because of the freeze I had just placed, and the lender's name matched the bank my father had mentioned. And I stood there with my hands in the sink and a level of relief that felt like oxygen, not because I enjoyed catching them in the act, but because prevention had done its job and because something inside me that had been wobbling for years finally locked into place. I forwarded the alert to the family thread with a short introduction that was not a threat and not a tantrum, but a boundary carved into stone, explaining that any future inquiries would be forwarded directly to the fraud department with the notes already on file, that my attendance at any meeting would only happen if the title change paperwork was prepared in advance with my share reflecting the risk I was asked to take, and that absent those conditions my answer would remain a clear and durable no, and within minutes my mother sent a message with more exclamation points than words, and my father called twice without leaving a voicemail, and my brother wrote that I was ruining his life with my theatrics. And I put the phone down because the performance was over for the night and because the next scene was going to happen on my stage. In the morning, a calendar invite arrived from my parents for a so-called family meeting at a notary office connected to the title company, and the subject line said quick paperwork, and the note said it was just a conversation. And I accepted the invitation without a comment because I had learned that a quiet yes placed at the right moment can be sharper than a shouted no, and as I closed my laptop I felt the steadiness that shows up when the plan is simple, because I was going to sit it there. table, listen to their lines, and answer with the one sentence that has always held the whole truth, and I was going to do it in front of the only witnesses that ever make a difference when families try to turn love into leverage. When the so-called family meeting finally happened, it was not in a courtroom or in a bank office or in front of strangers who could measure fairness by a code of law, but in the same dining room where birthdays had been celebrated and where countless arguments had been swept under rugs so thick with denial they could have cushioned a fall, and while the notary office idea had been floated earlier, my parents backtracked at the last minute, claiming it would be easier and less embarrassing to just sit down together at home and talk it through like adults who shared blood and history. And I agreed, because I knew the walls of that house carried more evidence than any stack of papers ever could. The table was set in that careful way my mother always believed gave the appearance of normalcy, with the good plates and folded napkins as if fine linen could make a conversation about betrayal feel like family dinner. And the smells of food filled the space in a way that felt more like a stage prop than hospitality, because everyone knew the real meal was the request they had already plated for me before I even arrived. My father cleared his throat the way he always does when he wants to deliver news he has already decided is final, and my mother held her fork too delicately, like it was an anchor she could drop if the conversation tilted too far into confrontation. And my brother leaned back as if victory were inevitable, because in his world everyone else's effort is his birthright and every rescue is already guaranteed. The speech began with the same lines I had heard in texts and calls, that family must support family, that times are uncertain, that a signature is lighter than a feather compared to the weight of love, and I let them say every word because sometimes silence is not weakness. It is a courtroom stenographer writing down evidence, and I wanted the record full before I opened my mouth. They repeated how much they had already given me, though the examples sounded suspiciously small when stacked against a house, and they dressed up the argument with nostalgia, mentioning how I once slept on my brother's couch during graduate school, as though borrowing a sofa in a family home somehow equaled transferring a property deed and demanding I cover his financial recklessness. I waited until their voices slowed, until they had nothing left but sighs and expectant looks, and then I placed my fork down slowly, deliberately, like a gavel, and said in a calm, even voice that I could not and would not put my name on debt that belonged to someone else, and that the conversation was not about helping or not helping, but about boundaries and choices, and that my boundary was clear and their choice had already been made the moment they put the house in his name and left me to find out through social media. The room shifted in a way that was almost physical, because they were used to bargaining with my silence and not my refusal, and when my father tried to object, I repeated it again, but with sharper edges, telling him that fairness is not charity and that if they wanted me to be the bank, then the collateral had to match, which meant adjusting the deed, and since they had no interest in fairness, but only in protection for their son, the answer was final. My brother, never able to sit quietly when the spotlight tilts away from him, slammed his hand on the table and shouted that I wanted him to fail, that I had always been jealous, that I was trying to tear down what he had built. And I almost laughed, because what he had built was nothing more than scaffolding held up by the constant pumping of resources from two parents who thought love meant permanent bailouts. My mother's eyes filled with a kind of theatrical sadness that might have worked on me when I was 12, but at 35 it just looked like another manipulation dressed up as heartbreak, and she whispered that I was tearing the family apart. To which I replied that a family already torn apart cannot be destroyed by honesty, and that if anything was being ripped it was the illusion that everyone was treated equally. The silence that followed was not empty but dense, the kind of silence that makes everyone hear their own pulse, and for once I let it stretch, because they needed to sit in it instead of filling it with excuses. And in that silence I saw something I had never seen before, the flicker of recognition on my father's face that maybe I was not going to bend this time, that maybe the version of me they had counted on, the endlessly reliable, quietly sacrificial daughter, had been replaced by someone who was finished playing a role she never auditioned for. I stood, thanked them for dinner, and gathered my things without rushing, because rushing would have looked like retreat, and before I left I looked directly at my brother, who was still seething, and said that responsibility is not a punishment, It is simply the other side of privilege, and that if he wanted the glory of owning a house, he would also have to carry the gravity of the loans that came with it. And then I turned to my parents and told them plainly that I wished them peace, but that peace could not come from my signature, and that they were free to love their favorite, but they were not free to bankrupt me in the process. As I closed the door behind me, I heard nothing but the scraping of chairs and the low hum of people finally realizing the script had ended without the conclusion they had written, and the satisfaction was not loud or triumphant, but steady. The kind of satisfaction that settles deep into the bones when you know you have taken the wheel of your own life back from hands that never should have steered it in the first place. In the weeks that followed that dinner, the silence between us became less like a pause in conversation and more like a wall built brick by brick, and every message that reached my phone carried a tone so uneven it was almost comical. With my mother swinging from guilt-soaked pleas about how she lay awake at night worrying over the family's future to sharp accusations that I had turned cold and ungrateful, with my father attempting his usual diplomatic detachment by suggesting that I would eventually come around because I had always been the sensible one, and with my brother throwing tantrums wrapped in sarcasm, claiming that my stubbornness was ruining his credit and staining his reputation. As if those things were not the natural consequence of his own choices, but my fault for not shielding him from reality. I did not respond to most of them, not because I lacked words, but because I had already said the only words that mattered, and repeating myself would have made it seem like my decision was negotiable, and I wanted them to finally understand that no meant no, that silence was not a crack in the door, but the lock snapping into place. At first I thought maybe the dust would settle, and they would retreat into denial, but instead they escalated, calling relatives and feeding them curated versions of the story where I was the selfish daughter who refused to support her own blood. And I received a phone call from an aunt I had not spoken to in years who wanted to know why I was letting my brother sink when I had the power to throw him a rope, and I realized then that my parents were not just desperate, they were willing to sacrifice my reputation within the family circle if that increased the pressure, and I answered my aunt with the same line I had given at the table, telling her that the rope had already been handed to him in the form of a house, and that if he could not hold on to it, that was not my failure to correct. And I could hear the pause on the other end of the line where she realized she had been drafted into a campaign without being told the full truth. The more they pushed, the steadier I felt, because each attempt to manipulate me only reminded me how many years I had allowed myself to be drafted into other people's emergencies, carrying burdens I had never created, solving problems that should never have been mine, and paying costs that were never reimbursed, and I found myself almost grateful for the clarity, because nothing burns away illusion faster than watching people prove exactly who they are when the script changes. I began taking steps that felt almost ceremonial, updating my legal documents to ensure there would be no assumption of financial dependency, removing my parents from the list of emergency contacts at work and replacing them with a close friend who had never once asked me to shoulder their mistakes, and meeting with a financial advisor to secure my accounts in a way that made me untouchable. Because I realized the greatest revenge was not screaming at them or trying to expose them to the world, but quietly cutting off every pipeline through which they had ever drawn on my strength without acknowledgement. When my father finally called me directly, not with anger but with a defeated heaviness I had not heard in his voice before, he told me that I was embarrassing the family and that one day I would regret burning bridges. And I said in the calmest tone I could manage that a bridge is only useful if it connects two places that want to meet in the middle, and that what they had built was not a bridge, but a one-way toll road where I paid for the journey and they decided the destination, and that I had no interest in keeping such a road open anymore. He went silent then, and I thought perhaps that silence would hold, but a few days later my mother tried again, this time through a carefully crafted letter left in my mailbox, handwritten in the style she thought would evoke childhood comfort, telling me that blood was thicker than water and that one day when they were gone I would regret refusing them this small request, and I sat at my kitchen table reading it and felt a strange sadness, not because her words pierced me, but because I realized she still believed manipulation disguised as sentiment could undo decades of imbalance. I did not write back with a long explanation, because explanations are currency they never valued, and instead I sent a single short message in the group thread we still shared, attaching a scan of the bureau notification that confirmed yet another blocked inquiry attempted under my name, and I wrote beneath it the sentence I had been saving for the final act, the one line that carried every truth without needing decoration. You picked your favorite, so let him handle it. It was not shouted, it was not cruel, it was simply precise, and in that precision lay the entire weight of every unequal decision, every quiet sacrifice, every moment I had been asked to carry more than my share. And for the first time I felt no urge to justify it, because the words themselves were the closing of the book. The aftermath was not fireworks or confrontation, but something quieter and in many ways more satisfying, because after that message the calls slowed, the text trickled into nothing, and even the gossip through relatives softened until it disappeared. And what remained was space, which is what I had wanted all along, space to live without being a permanent guarantor of someone else's failures, space to breathe without rehearsing excuses, space to plan my future with the knowledge that the door behind me was shut. Some people might call it cold, but to me it felt like balance restored, because justice does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the absence of demands, through the quiet knowledge that you no longer have to brace for the next ask. And so the final revenge was not about punishing them or watching them suffer. It was about letting them sit with the very choice they had celebrated so loudly, the choice to put everything in his name, to crown him the favorite, to hand him the spotlight, and making sure that when the light turned harsh and the bills came due, they had no one left to call but the man they had raised to believe he would never have to stand alone.